Welcome to Aero 2230 ProPilot 1 Presentation 2 on Private Pilot Basics. This presentation will review pilot training basics, medical certificates, pilot certificates, the definition of pilot in command, airplane categories and airplane classes as it applies to airman certification, additional pilot ratings, and we'll end by discussing human factors and ADM, or aeronautical decision making. Earning a private pilot certificate is governed by Part 61 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. To qualify as a private pilot, you must hold a student pilot certificate, be at least 17 years old, read, speak, write, and understand the English language, receive an endorsement from a flight instructor or a CFI to take the practical test, pass the private pilot airplane knowledge test, which is a computer-based test, and meet the aeronautical experience requirements. Finally, you must pass a practical test. In order to act as pilot in command, or PIC, a private pilot needs to have a FAA medical certificate issued by an aviation medical examiner. Our program at MTSU requires you to have at least a second-class medical. There are three classes of FAA medical certificates. The third class is required to act as PIC, or pilot in command, for any private pilot. The second class is required to act as PIC if you're a commercial pilot. In other words, you can't make money as a pilot unless you have a second-class medical. MTSU Flight Lab students are required to have at least a second-class medical initially. The second-class medical can revert to third-class privileges, and the student can still remain an active lab student. Finally, the first-class medical is required for airline transport pilot privileges. An Airline Transport Pilot Certificate, or ATP certificate, is required to act as an airline pilot. So if your goal after you graduate from MTSU is to work as an airline pilot, you may want to consider getting a first-class medical to make sure that you qualify. Here's an example of an FAA medical certificate issued by an aviation medical examiner. As you can see at the top, there's a blank space where the medical examiner can fill in the class of the certificate that the pilot is qualified for. The FAA medical examiner fills in the rest of the information on the certificate and then signs it, and then finally the airman signs at the bottom. It's important to remember that the medical certificate is not valid unless the airman signs it, so it's very important to remember to sign the certificate after you receive it. As you can see in this next slide, the duration of a medical certificate varies depending on the class of the certificate and the age of the pilot. And it's important to note that a medical certificate doesn't expire. The privileges of the medical certificate expire. So for the pilot under the age of 40, shown at the top of this slide, first class and second class medical privileges last for 12 months. After that 12 months is expired, the first class or second class medical reverts to third class privileges for up to 60 months total. The pilot 40 years old and older only qualifies for first class medical privileges for 6 months. After that 6-month period, the first class medical reverts to second class privileges for another 6 months. After that 6 months expires, the second class privileges revert to third class privileges for a total of 24 calendar months. To qualify as a private pilot, a student pilot must receive ground training in the following knowledge areas: the applicable federal aviation regulations as they apply to private pilot privileges, limitations, and flight operations, accident reporting requirements of the NTSB, or National Transportation Safety Board, use of all applicable portions of the Aeronautical Information Manual, or the AIM, use of aeronautical charts for VFR navigation, radio communication procedures, recognition of critical weather situations from the ground and in flight, wind shear avoidance, and procurement and use of aeronautical weather reports and forecasts, safe and efficient operation of aircraft, including collision avoidance and recognition and avoidance of wake turbulence, the effects of density altitude on takeoff and climb performance, weight and balance calculations, principles of aerodynamics, power plants and aircraft systems, stall awareness, spin entry, how to recover from a stall, aeronautical decision making and judgment, pre-flight action that includes how to obtain information on runway lengths at airports of intended use and data on takeoff and landing distances, weather reports and forecasts and fuel requirements, and how to plan for alternatives if a planned flight can't be completed as planned. The Private Pilot Knowledge Test is a computer-based test that consists of about 60 random questions from a bank of 871 FAA questions. There are many software programs available commercially that can help you prepare. The knowledge areas include questions associated with airplanes and aerodynamics, airplane instruments, engines and systems, airports, air traffic control, airspace, federal aviation regulations, airplane performance and weight and balance, aeromedical factors, aeronautical decision making, aviation weather services, navigation, charts and publications, navigation systems, cross-country flight planning. Private pilot aeronautical experience requirements include, for Part 61, solo requirements, a solo cross-country, solo flight to controlled airport, including 3 landings, a minimum of 40 hours of flight time, and usually a pilot has between 65 and 75 hours of flight time before they qualify for the check ride. MTSU has a Part 141 program, so all of our training is done under Part 141 of the Federal Aviation Regulations rather than Part 61. So that cuts our minimum training hours down to 35 for a private pilot's license. However, we are also approved under a special curriculum that means most of our flight training is done to proficiency, and there are no real minimum flight times for certificates or ratings. There are 3 stages of training in the MTSU flight training program. Each stage includes an objective and completion standards, and each stage ends with what's called a stage check to ensure that you're proficient and you can advance to the next stage of training. At the end of the 3rd stage, your instructor will submit you for an end-of-course check ride. That's a mock check ride, and if you pass that, your instructor will submit you for the private pilot check ride with a designated pilot examiner. Once you're submitted for the private pilot check ride and you've passed the end of course check, which simulates the FAA practical test, that will include a ground portion or knowledge check and also a flight portion or a flight check. Then you'll work with your flight instructor to file an application for a new pilot certificate. The application for a new pilot certificate is called the 8710 form, and here's a picture of that form. Everything is now online in a system called IACRA, I-A-C-R-A. The form needs to be completed online and then submitted to be available to the FAA designated pilot examiner. The FAA practical test, it consists of a knowledge check, a ground portion, and also a flight test. And these are sometimes performed directly by the FAA inspectors, but more often than not, they're done by designated pilot examiners who are contractors with the FAA. So we've discussed medicals and how long medical certificates last. And we've also discussed how they technically never expire, but to continue to use the privileges of your medical or your private pilot certificate, you need to maintain at least a third-class medical and receive a flight review from a certified flight instructor at least every 24 calendar months. Now let's look at some FAA pilot terminologies. The word category is used by the FAA to describe both pilot certification and aircraft certification. In this class, we are going to talk primarily about airman certification. So when we say category as far as certification of an airman means either airplane, rotorcraft, glider, powered lift, or lighter than air. In other words, when I say what is a category, the answer is either airplane, rotorcraft, glider, powered lift, or lighter than air. In this slide you see examples of aircraft categories and classes. In the upper left-hand corner is the airplane category, and that includes the classes of single-engine land, multi-engine land, single-engine sea, and multi-engine sea. To the right of that, you have the rotorcraft category. Rotorcraft category includes classes of gyroplane and helicopter. Glider does not have a separate class, and airship and balloon class belongs to the lighter than air category. And then finally you have the powered lift category. So when you get your private pilot certificate, you will have the words single engine land for the class of aircraft that you're qualified to fly. You could add multi-engine land, single engine sea, multi-engine sea to those categories. The type of aircraft is just the make and model of the aircraft. So if you get your license in a Diamond DA-40, that's the type of aircraft that you were trained in. That's not going to be on your certificate. So your certificate will indicate the category and class of airplane that you can fly, that you're qualified to fly. It will not indicate any type of aircraft. So your certificate will say airplane for the category, and for the class it will simply say single engine land. However, that doesn't mean that you're qualified to fly all single engine land aircraft. For example, the aircraft in this slide is a tail dragger. It doesn't have a tricycle landing gear. And the FAA requires a pilot to get certain training in order to qualify to fly a tail dragger. It's not an additional rating, it's just an endorsement from a flight instructor. So can you fly this airplane if your flight experience was only in a Diamond DA-40? No, the answer is no, because in this case, to fly a tailwheel airplane, a private pilot must earn a logbook endorsement from a CFI. If all of your experience before you got your private pilot's license was in a Diamond DA-40, could you fly one of these aircraft in this slide? These are complex airplanes. On the left you see a Mooney. It's a complex aircraft with retractable landing gear, movable flaps, and a constant speed propeller. And the answer is no, you can't fly a complex airplane unless you receive training from a CFI and an endorsement. And finally, if all of your experience is in a Diamond DA-40, could you fly this airplane? This is a jet aircraft, a turbojet aircraft, and the regulations require you to have a type rating in order to fly this aircraft. So the answer is no. Now we move on to aeronautical decision making, or ADM, and human factors. ADM is a systematic method to help pilots make critical aviation decisions both before and during a flight. Safety is always number one. In the early days of aviation, accidents were usually caused by mechanical problems because airplanes weren't as reliable as they are now. Unfortunately, accidents are continuing to happen, and most experts believe that the growth in accidents over the next several decades will be due primarily to human factors. So aeronautical decision making helps us prioritize our task. And the one thing that you should always remember, the first priority in any situation is to always fly the airplane. Do not lose sight of the fact that you must always fly and control the airplane. It's important for you to remember as a new pilot that you don't have the aviation knowledge or experience to help you make decisions in the airplane and before you get into the airplane. However, ADM, or aeronautical decision making, can help you understand the process of decision making and be aware of your own attitudes as they relate to decision making. There are certain tools that we can use as pilots to help us make critical aviation decisions. One of those tools is depicted in this slide. It's called the DECIDE model. DECIDE stands for detect, estimate, choose, identify, do, and evaluate. So let's say you're in an airplane, you're on a flight, and you detect that something isn't right. So that's the first part of the DECIDE checklist, the D for detect. Then you estimate. You estimate the need to counter or react to that change that you've detected. The next step is to choose a desirable outcome. How do you want this to end up? Of course, we want to be able to land safely. And then we identify the action that we need to take to successfully control the change. And then we do it. And then after we do it, we evaluate it. And this is a circular process. Once we evaluate the effect of the action that we took to counter the change, if something still isn't right, then we go back to the first part and detect what is still wrong, estimate the need to counter or react to the change, choose, identify, do, and then evaluate again. As I said before, most aviation accidents in the early days of aviation were due to mechanical difficulties because airplanes, mechanically, they were not as reliable as they are today. Now, in modern days, now that we have very reliable machines, most of the accidents that occur in aviation are due to human factors. Nearly 80% of all aviation accidents are due to a human factor, due to maybe a bad decision that a pilot made, maybe fatigue, illness, something caused the accident other than a mechanical problem. In this graph labeled workload versus capability, you can see pilot capabilities graphed against task requirements at different phases of flight. So taxi, takeoff, and cruise, the task requirements are quite low compared to pilot capabilities. So there's a big margin of safety. But once we get to the approach and landing phase of flight, you can see that the task requirements are very close to pilot capabilities. And that's typically where most aviation accidents occur. As pilots, we need to constantly monitor risk. This is called risk management. Risk will always exist. There's no way to avoid it. But we can be constantly on guard and detect these risks. One human factor that all pilots should be aware of and become familiar with are the hazardous attitudes. The 5 hazardous attitudes are anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. And we all exhibit these hazardous attitudes every now and then. So it's important for us to recognize them when they occur in us personally as pilots and when they occur in others. The antidote to the anti-authority hazardous attitude is follow the rules. They're usually right. For impulsivity, not so fast, think first. Invulnerability, it could happen to me. Macho, taking chances is foolish. And resignation, you're not helpless, you can make a difference. So remember these hazardous attitudes and remember the antidotes. And if you see one of these hazardous attitudes being exhibited by someone else or even by yourself, remember the antidote. So just to review, we started out by discussing pilot training basics. What is required by the regulations to qualify as a private pilot? Then we reviewed medical certificates, different classes of medical certificates, the different privileges, as well as the different durations. We talked about pilot certificates, the student pilot certificate versus the private pilot certificate, pilot in command or PIC and what that means, and what is required to act as PIC. We reviewed the airplane categories and all of the classes associated with those categories, and additional pilot ratings needed in order to fly some special airplanes like complex aircraft or tail draggers. And then we finished by discussing human factors and how they affect aviation, accidents, and aeronautical decision making, or ADM. In the next presentation, we'll discuss the different documents that are required for a pilot to carry on their person as well as in the aircraft, and then we'll start to review aircraft systems.